Welcome everyone to today's Caregiving Journey webinar by Carallel, Complex Caregiving Emotions and How to Manage Them. I'm Matt Perrin. I'm a caregiver for my mom, Rosemary, who's living with Alzheimer's disease. I'm also Director of Caregiver Engagement here at Carallel, and I am lucky enough to be your host today. So thanks everyone for joining. Really excited to have you here, and just as excited to introduce in a very special guest, somebody that I've learned, I don't even think he knows it, but I've learned a ton from by reading his writing. And he is a clinical psychologist, a family therapist, a prolific author on caregiving topics. You might have seen his name, there's byline at AARP, and he's written several books. Pleased to introduce just a renowned caregiving expert, Barry Jacobs. How are you, Barry?
That's such a gracious introduction, Matt. Thank you so much. But you left out one really important biographical piece of information, and that is, I was a caregiver for my mom and stepdad with their, they had dementia. I did that for about 7 years. Unfortunately, they're both passed at this point, but that to me is the most important credential for this conversation today.
Well, I appreciate it. My apologies for leaving that out. I knew that and somehow omitted it on my notes here, but glad you could join us, and thanks very much. As we're going to hop right in, it's going to be a jam-packed 30 minutes, but do have a couple of housekeeping items to knock out before we get into the meat of the session here. First and foremost, if anyone's joining one of these calls for the first time, just a bit of context on who Carallel is. And we're a company that provides a caregiver support solution that helps caregivers in two primary ways. First and foremost, we provide one-to-one personalized confidential support via our service called My Care Advocate. This is for caregivers on-demand access to our caregiving experts who are professional, trained, credentialed, and either currently or formerly family caregivers, and they're ready to help roll up their sleeves, listen, and help you with whatever caregiving challenges you have on your plate in a given day, week, month, etc. They're available via phone, email, and chat. We complement that one-to-one support with our own proprietary digital tool called My Care Desk. I think of it really as part caregiving Wikipedia, part caregiving Swiss Army knife, and part caregiving Cliff Notes. So whether you need to, an easy way to streamline communication with family and friends around the care of a loved one, or ask for help, or learn about caregiving topics, or have one central location to store important documents, or anything else, My Care Desk has you covered. So a bit of context on Carallel. Secondly, we're going to go, I've mentioned we have 30 minutes or so and a lot to cover, especially on this topic, Barry. So if you do have questions, please do drop them in the chat. We'll do our best to address them live in the session. Any that we're not able to address, I'll certainly follow up and make sure they're addressed after the event. So now that the housekeeping's out of the way, Barry, what do you say we get started?
Sounds good.
All right, great. So I think, as is customary, this is my second session that I'm leading here on the Caregiving Journey webinars. So I am going to launch a poll, which I understand is customary, to get us started and hopefully hear from the audience. So what's the most difficult caregiving emotion for you to manage? You can select one of the following: guilt, anger, loneliness, happiness. All right, we see some voting happening. We're 75% guilt, 25% loneliness, 60-40. I love that everybody's jumping in and voting. So I'm going to go ahead and close out the poll here. All right, so we have some guilt is the winner, Barry. Anger is 14%, and then loneliness 29%. All right, so any surprises on that?
No surprises. I mean, guilt and caregiving unfortunately go hand in hand, and it's certainly a good topic for us to discuss today.
Absolutely, and we could talk about any of the emotions we'll cover probably for 4 or 5 hours, but you'd almost think that I scripted it this way, that guilt would be the winner of the first poll, because that's that's the first emotion I was hoping to talk about. And why don't we structure the conversation to make the best use of the time, Barry? I'll throw out an emotion, and I would love to get your reaction. Is it valid? Is it not? And maybe a tip or two, a practical tip or two, because that's our goal. We're all about the practical in these sessions to hopefully help audience members manage the emotion that we're talking about. Does that sound all right?
Yes, it does.
Awesome, great. So yeah, I guess we spoiled the surprise, but the first emotion I wanted to bring up is guilt, and because I would have voted guilt as well if I were voting in the poll, and I just I can't get rid of it. I guess is what I would say. I'm 7.5 years into my caregiving journey for my mother, and thanks to a good friend a few years ago, I learned the difference between earned and unearned guilt, and that really helped. Earned guilt being, I do something that sort of is at odds with my moral compass, my values, right? I've earned that guilt. And sure, there's some of that that comes with caregiving in my experience, but the bigger portion of guilt, the omnipresent portion of guilt for me anyway, is this unearned guilt, where I just feel guilty about everything, not doing this or doing that, or I feel guilty for feeling happy in brief moments, right, in the midst of all this caregiving. So what would you say to that? How can we handle that guilt? How can we manage it? We can't get rid of it, I'm imagining, but how can we manage it more effectively?
Yeah. So I like the way you divided guilt up into different types of guilt, because in fact, I think that's true. I mean, guilt is a big umbrella term, and there are specific things that fall into that. So, the first thing you mentioned was this idea of earned guilt, and that is, when we do something wrong, we know is wrong, we feel guilty. And so what I have seen over the years with caregivers is a very common guilt that they'll feel is when they get very irritated at the person that they're caring for, because they're tired, or maybe because the person they're caring for has dementia and is repeating the same things again and again, and it just gets on the caregiver's nerves. And that is that the caregiver then uses a tone of irritation or even yells at the person who they're caring for. And I've seen caregivers beat themselves up forever when it comes to that kind of situation, and blaming themselves for having hurt the person who is defenseless. And I understand that they did wrong. They understand that they did wrong. So in terms of thinking about tips here, I mean, what I think we have to ask ourselves with that type of guilt is there, can we accept our imperfections? Can we accept our mistakes and do better? And I'm hoping that we're all, self-forgiving enough that we can, and that we don't hold ourselves to some perfect standard that no human being could ever reach. I mean, what I often say to people who share with me that they yelled at their loved one is, before your loved one had dementia, did you ever yell at them? And the answer is almost invariably yes.
Yeah.
Did you feel guilty of that before? Well, maybe, but they feel much guiltier now. But the fact is, we're human beings, and we lose our temper sometimes. So that's one type of guilt. The other type of guilt, which you mentioned, sometimes falls into the category of what's called survivor guilt, and that is, I'm doing fine, my loved one is not, and I feel bad about that. And I think of this as a kind of empathy. I mean, we care about our loved one. We want to see them do well. When they suffer, we suffer. And by the way, there's a lot of research to suggest that this idea that their suffering causes us suffering. But our suffering, in fact, it doesn't help them one bit, right? We feel for them, but if we suffer along with them, it doesn't improve their situation. It doesn't comfort them. It doesn't do the sort of things that we want to do for them. And so, I've seen some caregivers that because they feel guilty that they could go out to the store and their loved one can't, that they don't go to the store. And in what I always say to those folks is, if your loved one could speak for themselves cogently right now, would they tell you not to go to the store? Of course they wouldn't. So, is we have to do our best to help our loved ones. That doesn't mean depriving ourselves in the process, because our self-deprivation doesn't improve our performance as caregivers. It doesn't make us better able to help them. It doesn't demonstrate some sort of fidelity, fealty to their suffering. So I think you get the gist of this.
Yeah, it makes sense. And so I'd never thought about it in terms of in the terms of survivor's guilt. So it's really interesting for me to hear you frame it that way. And the other thing that, when you mentioned sort of the empathy, or you mentioned empathy as it relates to guilt, and this just like so much in caregiving, this is just a sort of tangled web, right, of emotion. But it prompted a thought. So a friend gave me a card once with nothing else on it but a quote. And I'm not going to remember. I think it's an author by the name of Jack Kornfeld. I'm not positive on that, but the quote was.
A lot of quotes about Jack Kornfeld out there in the world.
But it was it stuck with it. I'm not familiar with Jack Kornfeld, the author, and his work, but I think the quote went like this, and I don't have the card anymore, but I've remembered it ever since. And it's, if your compassion doesn't include yourself, it's incomplete, right? So you mentioned empathy, but I kind of I thought immediately about that quote as you were mentioning that. So, and the interesting part about guilt, or the hard part, I should say, for me anyway, is because I'm an expert in nothing but my own experience, is that it's tied to all the other emotions. It feels like, So the next one is resentment that I wanted to bring up with you, and resentment, jealousy, what have you. But I'm in a situation where I'm caring for my mom. My wife and I have a young family. We have, when I see my friends doing certain things, or hanging out with their parents and having their kids with their grandparents, or whatever it may be, I find myself, and this is as embarrassing as it is to admit, feeling kind of resentful and jealous about that, and so that's like step one of a 1-2 punch, and then I feel guilty or stupid for feeling jealous about those sorts of things. How would you, I can't believe that I'm the only caregiver out there that feels sort of resentment. What would you say about that? Help me understand myself.
Yeah, what I would say, Matt, is that number one, I relate to this personally, and so to give you 2 examples. I mean, this was not a caregiving situation, but well, my dad had brain cancer while I was a teenager, and so I felt really different than all my other friends. I mean, they had both parents. My dad was disabled, and then my dad died. I was the youngest person I knew who had lost a parent, and I would go to ball games with my friends and their parents, and I always felt this absence of my dad, but also this envy that my friends had their dads and I didn't have mine. So I relate to that. Then I can say also, in the years that I was caring for my mom with her dementia, I often had that feeling that my friends were going out to restaurants, and if I went out to a restaurant, I half the time I would get a call. I had to rush home to make sure that my mom was okay because the aide didn't show up. So I mean, I think my point here is I think your feelings of resentment and envy are normal, and that, as with all human emotions, they are valid. And we have to forgive ourselves, and they may not be bringing out the best in ourselves, but they're part of who we are. And I think it's bad enough that we feel envy. To then feel guilty about envy it's like rubbing salt in your own wounds. It doesn't help. And I think we are fallible. So you mentioned the card with Jack Kornfeld's quote on it. I had a colleague, a family physician I worked with for many years. She had a card that had her name and credentials on it, and then underneath it said "work in progress." And I always loved that because, as a person as she was, she saw herself as a work in progress. We're all works in progress. No matter how old we are, no matter how much we think we've experienced and learned about life. And trying to stop feeling envious is something that we're all working on. We're all works in progress in that regard, and we have to kind of be compassionate toward ourselves in that way.
I love that, work in progress. And again, as you were talking there, I was thinking, you gave me a little bit of an aha moment where I think one of the hidden challenges in sort of being on this emotional roller coaster, for me, again, is just, it's recognizing the emotion that I'm feeling or the emotions, because a lot of like, it's not always clear to me. Sometimes it's I'm just pent up and on edge, but I'm not necessarily identifying with one emotion or one or two emotions, or I'm not like consciously saying, oh, I'm feeling guilty right now. It's sort of beneath the surface. So what I was taking from your comments was just trying to get in touch with sort of the root cause of the feeling or emotion in a given moment is in and of itself can be helpful. Is that fair?
Yes, it absolutely is. I mean, so I'm kind of laughing a little bit about what you said, because I too have that problem, not always recognizing what I feel. That's why I have my wife. My wife says, "You're feeling guilty, buddy."
Yeah.
And I say, "Really? I guess I am."
Yeah.
What you're saying is that the ability to self-reflect and kind of look inside ourselves and to say, like, what's going on in there right now? I mean, why am I all pent up? I mean, what is it I'm upset about? What is it I'm sad about? What is it I'm anxious about? That I think gives us an insight into what we're experiencing in a given time. And then with that insight comes a little greater control over it. And I'll just kind of throw out one other thing, and I'm just saying this to you, Matt, because you're a guy and I'm a guy, and that is, men are kind of notoriously bad at identifying their emotions or even expressing the full range of emotions. And for many men, all emotion comes out as anger. And we may be sad, it comes out as anger. We may be frightened, anxious, it comes out as anger. So to be able to look past anger, for instance, and to see what's beneath it is very important for men.
Yeah, that's a fair point for sure. And sort of all of this ties into some of the classic sort of self-care sort of thinking and tactics. Like I don't do it enough, but when I need to step back and sort of look within to figure out what has me sort of all locked up in a given moment is, a quick walk helps me do that. I say that with some trepidation because, and this is a topic for another day, self-care as a topic, as a buzzword, understanding how important it is, it kind of sometimes drives me nuts personally as a caregiver, because it's hard to, I know I need to take care of myself. I have a guttural reaction in some cases to the self-care thing. But this is an instance where if I'm feeling, I'm feeling sort of locked up and I'm not necessarily sure why, and I need to know why so I can deal with it, so I can let it, whatever that emotion is, run its course. Taking a quick walk might help me there.
I mean, that's, I agree. That's about clearing your head. And I'll just say one other thing in regard to self-reflection, and that it's one of the best ways of doing that is keeping a journal. So, during my caregiving years, I kept a journal, and it's amazing when I go back and look at it now. It's like seething with resentment. It's like I can't believe how resentful I was. But even in the course of writing, at the time, it brought me into better contact with what was going on inside of me. I couldn't just push my emotions aside so easily.
That's a good point. Good point. And it's another thing that I haven't done enough of, but duly noted. So time flies when we're having fun. We're at 12:20 here, and I want to get to so anger. I think we've what we've just talked about. I think pretty well covers anger. It in a lot of ways to me. My main challenge with the anger is recognizing the root cause, and you've just given me sort of a practical tip to hopefully make it a little easier for myself to do some self-reflection in sort of real time, or as I'm feeling that way, to resolve it, right, and move on with my day or my evening or what have you. But the anger is everywhere. but for the sake of time, I'm going to table it. Loneliness was, 29% of the audience voted that loneliness was the most difficult caregiving emotion for them to manage. And I would have voted guilt, but I would have asked the moderator for 2 votes because I would have wanted to vote for loneliness too. And my wife and I became caregivers at the same time. Me for my mom, with Lindsay, my wife, as part of with helping me as part of my mom's care team, and vice versa for me and her father, my father-in-law, who was living in our home until last October when he passed away from Lewy body dementia. But we were going through much of our caregiving together, and we'd be on the couch together, solving the problem of the day or doing research on something, and each on our own laptop or what have you. And so we're going through it physically next to each other and still feeling lonely, right? So that's how pervasive the loneliness aspect is. Can you talk a little bit about, how we can deal with the loneliness as caregivers?
Sure, Matt. I mean, so loneliness is, there are two ways we can think about loneliness. So one is when people are really socially isolated, where they're home alone, with their person they're caring for, and they're not seeing anybody else, they're not hearing from family members, they're not seeing friends who used to come around, and they're really cut off from the world. And so social isolation is real. So many caregivers suffer social isolation, especially when friends and family members seem to kind of back off from them. They don't want to deal with their situation. And, we have lots of ways of trying to deal with social isolation. We have family caregiver support groups. We have memory cafes. We have other means of bringing people together who are in similar circumstances. So decreasing social isolation is really important. The second sense of loneliness is that you get people who are among other people and still feel lonely because they feel different. They feel that they feel that their situation is such that other people really can't relate to them, and even when they're in the company of other people, they feel alone. And that's a situation which I think is a little harder to deal with. I mean, social isolation is hard, mind you, but you can connect people. But when people feel internally that they're cut off from other people because they're dealing with something that other people don't understand, then it puts them in a position of do they just keep that situation to themselves, or they try to explain that situation to other people so that other people can empathize? Do other people really want to hear it? Or when someone says to you, how you doing, you say fine, because you know that they don't really want to hear how you're doing. And so the answer there really, and it's easier said than done, is to find people who really do understand, find people who really do care, who can, it's the emotional connection of real caring. When you really feel someone is with you, that helps decrease that type of loneliness. And so too, it may be finding people who are also caregivers, who are or have been caregivers, who kind of get it, and then they get it. They can relate to you, they can relate to what you're feeling, and you don't feel so alone.
Yeah. And it's interesting. So first of all, I just learned something in the way you sort of bifurcate, the overarching concept of loneliness into 2 different buckets. The challenge for me with loneliness is I was suggested to go to a support group, and these types of things. And support groups are great, and they have a purpose. They're not all alike, and for me, they just didn't really fit, right? Because I was really after connection, and it just, in some cases, the support groups that I visited, and they're not all this way, but this was the experience that I had, were just somewhat almost piling on the sadness, right? Which is another emotion that we haven't even gotten to today. But so, social media helped me, right? There's some great groups, and I online on Facebook support groups, and I'm a Twitter user, so meeting other caregivers on Twitter. So social media is in terms of like the very practical sort of ways we can get some of that connection that you talk about. Social media, if someone isn't already, is something that I would suggest to people, because what I really love about it is I have the ability to filter, right? And sort of choose what I'm what I'm consuming, who I'm connecting with, those sorts of things. So I just wanted to interject that. We do have a question here, and we're almost out of time. From an audience member, are there resources or suggestions for explaining terminal illness and prepping a young child for the death of a grandparent? So, so Barry, why don't you touch on that real quick?
Sure. There are children's books written specifically for that purpose. I can't name one off the top of my head, but any librarian or any children's book person could direct you to them. There are many to help explain things. A lot of it is going to depend on the age of the child. I mean, a child who doesn't really understand the concept of death, that would be any child probably below the age of 5. It's going to be harder to explain children above age 5 who may have a more, a better sense of what it is, the idea of death, and how do you explain that? Do you use, if your family has a religious or cultural perspective on this, do you bring that to bear? That's what many families do to help children accept it in that context. So the quick answer is look for children's books that are age appropriate on this, and please take into account that children at different ages need different types of explanations.
Thanks for that, Barry. It's a great suggestion. One other thing, a Carallel specific response to that question also would be that is precisely the type of thing that one of the Carallel care advocates could coach you through. So if you have access to Carallel, which I believe you do, if you're on this call, please do call a care advocate. They'd be more than willing, they'd be happy to walk you through thinking about that discussion, planning for that discussion, and giving you some really practical tips on ways to approach it, in addition to other resources like children's books, etc. So, and then lastly, we also have a fair amount of content on that as well inside of my care desk. So thank you very much for that question. Hopefully that answer helps, and if you'd want more follow-up, please do send me an email by responding to your confirmation email for this event. Barry, time flies when we're having fun. We're at the end of, or at the bottom of the hour here. So I'm going to quickly launch our second poll, and just because I was interested in what the audience might say, where do you go for emotional support as a caregiver? Friends or family, support group, therapist, or I don't have any?
I'm taking bets, Matt.
Yeah. What are you wagering on?
I'm thinking that friends and family are going to be one, but number 2, a close second is to be I don't have any emotional support.
You're correct. So 100% of the vote in. Actually, 75% friends and family. So I'm really happy to hear that. That the folks on the phone today have friends and family they're able to go to. Second was I don't have any, as you wagered, so you would have been in the money, Barry. And therapist was third. So close that poll out. And I got to think about maybe extending the time for these sessions, Barry, because this went by in a blink. But I definitely learned a ton. Hope the audience did as well. Any parting thoughts?
I would just say to everybody that my main message to caregivers is be kind to yourself, be kind to others, and that you're doing really hard work. And by being kind, being compassionate to yourself, you really save yourself a lot of trouble, and you'll reduce some of the guilt.
Love it, Barry. Thanks so much for joining us. Hope to see you again soon.
Hey, thank you, Matt.
Thanks, everyone, for being here. Stay tuned for details on our March events that'll be out soon. Have a great day. Thank you.